Welcome, listeners, to Assiduous Dust. I'm your host, Joshua Corwin, and this is the home of the OTSCP On The Spot Collaborative poem. And today you are in for a groovalicious, groove-tastic, groove energy synergized treat. We have Mike the Poet Sonksen with us today, and I'm super excited, and I hope you guys are. Mike is super inspirational, and I am grateful to have him on. Listeners, for those of you who don't know about Mike the Poet, here's a little bit about him. There's so much more, but this is what he gave me. Mike Sonksen, aka Mike the Poet, is a third-generation Los Angeles native. He's a poet, professor, journalist, historian, and tour guide extraordinaire. His latest book, Letters to My City, is published with Writ Large Press. His poetry has been featured on public radio stations, KCRW, KPCC, and KPFK, and TV programs like Spectrum News, just to name a few. Sonksen has taught high school for 5 years, and now he teaches at Woodbury University. Actually, he professes at Woodbury University. There's a difference between teaching and professing, in my opinion. So, Mike, I'm glad to have you on here. So tell me, I always see Spectrum News on there. How do you get that? And what's it like being Mike the Poet, or more so, why Mike the Poet with the capital T? I've always wondered that what's going on there. I'm sure that there's some people that when they see that, they're like, is this a typo? So could you tell me a tiny bit about that?
Man, Joshua, it's nice to be here. Thanks for having me on the show. There's a lot of different answers and a lot of different stories, but when I was about 23, a friend of mine, Tony Fleming, aka Tone Tech, a hip-hop MC, nicknamed me Mike the Poet, because at the time, we just basically spoke poetry, especially my friend Philip Martin, aka Philharmonic, and I. We would have like these 10-hour freestyle sessions. You talk about on-the-spot collaborative poem. We were living in the land of the on-the-spot collaborative poems and freestyles, and so that's why when you're sending me poems or you're telling me about your latest piece, the spirit that you have where you're writing 2, 3, 4 pieces a day very much reminds me of how it was for me right around the time I was graduating from UCLA and through a lot of my 20s. And so I was nicknamed Mike the Poet. Part of it, my buddy Tony nicknamed me that, but also a lot of people could never say Sonksen. It's not that it's that difficult to pronounce, but some people
sometimes you think it's Sonksen, or is it Sonksen?
Yeah.
And you got to think, wait, it's Sonksen, or something, and then you do this weird kind of thing. Some people might just say Sonksen. Mike Sonksen.
You know what? I mean, I heard a lot of different things, and so my buddy Phil was like, Tony and some of the guys used to call me Mike the Poet. Phil was just like, yeah, when you go to these venues, just have them call you Mike the Poet. And I remember one time I was at a venue, and there was one guy. This was before I told people to call me Mike the Poet, and he, it was almost like he mispronounced my name on purpose and was kind of, trying to be a dick or whatever. So it was also one of those things where I was just like, Mike the Poet was easier. And at the time, in the spoken word scene of the late 90s, right, everybody had kind of a nom de plume anyway. People had a lot of nicknames, and we had a crew called Poets of the Round Table, and everybody pretty much had their own AKA.
I guess they dance when they are able, right?
Yeah, and you know what? The AKAs were just like, we were hanging out with a lot of DJs and graffiti artists and singer-songwriters, and everybody had a couple of identities, and it was a combination, and we were reading the beats, Neil Cassidy was Dean Moriarty, and and all these different different names these guys had, but also the Wu-Tang Clan, and so we were somewhere between the beat generation and hip-hop and graffiti artists and DJs, and so the AKAs were just a part of it, almost like the superhero identity. And I remember I used to send out all these emails all the time about poetry shows, and I'd be like, best kept Strychnine and Rat Pack Slim, hosted by Mike the Poet. And I remember one time, my stepdad is a real funny dude, and I was sending out these emails, and he wrote me back. He's like, "What time is Mac the Butter Knife getting on?" He was just clowning around, but that was the time. And I think the capital T at the end of Mike the Poet was just people used to play with the way they would put the layout on the page, and a lot of that was just fun experimenting. And then I'm not so hung up on any of that anymore, but some of it stuck. Some people, and around the time I had my kids and more of my journalism, I went more and more by Mike Sonksen. But anybody that's known me over 15, 20 years, anybody that's known me from the poetry scene of, early 2000s, late 90s, still probably calls me Mike the Poet. But it was a fun time period, man. And it was our rite of passage. And then, we all kind of grew up in the art scene, really, I would say.
Yeah. So what I'm curious about, language is so interesting. It's kind of like this dance, and you can do these things with it. And you mentioned about identity and how people have these different names or pseudonyms or nom de plumes that they go by. And you kind of look at how, because I know much of your work is place is so important to your work, and looking at the change of this unfolding tapestry, especially of Los Angeles County and Los Angeles City, and kind of looking at the area of how it changes and how it morphs over time. And you can kind of look how the music changes, and also the way we use words and language. You think, and you go back to Shakespeare times, or all those kinds of things. People weren't reading Shakespeare in Shakespeare's time; they were reading Shakespeare later. But you kind of look at how language does a bit of a dance that affects our identity. And it also affects the, is there a relationship between that and the architecture, and how that kind of got involved in your poetry, and kind of keeping a museum of words, so to speak, or a museum of the times in your words.
Yeah.
And how that's kind of affected your identity and guided you throughout the years. If you could mention a bit about that, and how it's maybe 2 or 3 key points in your life that it's kind of shifted. However you interpret this complex, convoluted question.
You know what? That's a good question, because at the end of my UCLA time, I was an undergraduate sociology major, but I was writing a lot of short neighborhood profiles, and I took a few classes in urban planning. And for a time, I had wanted to go to graduate school in urban planning. And at 23, I applied for UCLA's graduate program in urban planning, but I hadn't done any internships. All I was at the time was kind of a street poet that was more of an autodidact. I mean, my last year at UCLA, I did really well, but my first couple of years at UCLA, I was too busy running around the city to really even concentrate on school. And so...
Right, it's everything else that distracts you. You're like, I want to study or do what I want to kind of do to dive inward,
And so then halfway or 2/3 of the way through my time at UCLA, I discovered this whole field called urban planning, which I had been kind of studying the whole time without knowing that there was more of a formal title for that. I thought I was just studying the city. And I had read, one of my biggest influences obviously was Mike Davis, who was my professor, but I didn't have him until my final year at UCLA. But I had actually read him for I'd read his work for over 3 years before I even studied with him. And he wrote a book called City of Courts in 1990 that essentially predicted the LA riots 2 years before they happened.
Wow.
And so...
And that might be something that's also of interest for listeners to go ahead and maybe reread back on the lens that we have at the times also.
Yeah, no, Mike Davis, he recently put out a new book called Set the Night on Fire, LA in the 60s. And it's a great book. And he's written about 15 books. And so there was several influences. So, in the times of the early 90s, mid 90s, my buddy Phil and I and different folks, we were going to a lot of readings. We were going to shows. I mean, we saw Rage Against the Machine at UCLA right before they were famous.
Nice.
We saw Sublime at UCLA just as they were becoming famous. We saw Farside, saw all, Tribe Called Quest, De La Soul, all these folks from whether it was in Hollywood, whether it was, we went down to the Good Life Cafe in the Crenshaw District, and I went and saw events in Leimert Park and did a lot of, went to the places in Venice 2, 3, 4 years before I ever got on a microphone in Leimert. Or, we were going to, I've been hearing about Beyond Baroque for probably 5, 6, 7 years before I ever got on I probably didn't even get on the stage at Beyond Baroque until the late 90s. But I'd heard about it from the time I was in my teens on KCRW. They would say, oh, Beyond Baroque. And I, so we started, there's a famous underground rapper I love named Tumex, and Tumex always says, we were the fans that became artists. And I can
That's a great quote.
I can relate with that because we were digesting everything we could get our hands on, whether it was, as I see these film posters behind you, whether it was music or film or books or art.
You're gone with the wind and you find yourself with Lawrence in Arabia.
Man, next thing you know, right, North by Northwest, man, and it's real, I mean, I remember we knew who the artist Mirror One was, and then 4 or 5 years later, he's doing my book cover. And, he became, first things first.
Right.
It started with a love of the city, and it started with just appreciating the culture, and to bring it back to identity.
Right, and that internalization, because you kind of become and how that affects you and your writing.
And so processing all of these, the stimulus, processing the people you meet. There were also some people that were very kind to me. I remember, I showed Mike Davis my first LA poems in the late 90s, and he's like, these are cool. And I mean, he didn't even really tell me too much about writing. He just gave me books and he encouraged me, and
right.
And have you ever heard of Peter Sellers? He was a professor of
world art. Yes, of course.
And
of course.
And Sellers,
for listeners who aren't familiar, maybe if you could give a tiny bit more background.
Sellers is a playwright and even kind of choreographer, and he's in the World Arts and Cultures department at UCLA, and he taught a class called Art is Social Action. He also taught another class called Art is Moral Action, and he was one of the first lecturers I ever heard that could captivate 300-400 people. Like, it's funny, as I teach now, I do a little bit of lecturing, but I like to have him do some writing. I try not to even talk that much. I mean, I'll do plenty of talking when I perform my poetry or whatever, but
the teacher and the taught teach the teaching, like the KOAN, or what, not KOAN, the saying that the good teacher kind of, you become invisible, and you kind of, people say, oh, we did it all on our own. And that's how you're a good teacher, when it's like, you inspire and bring that light out.
Yeah, Sellers was really cool like that. I mean, I remember I showed him some of my first stuff too, and he was just like, see you around, kid. When I was 22 and somebody said, see you around, kid, it meant that...
It's almost Dirty Harry-like.
Yeah, I mean, it was really... So that time was a really inspiring time, and it had a lot to do... I always say this, in my early 20s, I knew I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't quite know what to do or how to do it next. So the first thing we did was we went to 1 million open mics, and then blogs started, and there was a few websites, and I was writing for these little music magazines. And
like, you've done stuff for, what is it, KCET?
Yeah, that's been my site that I've done over 200 articles on. That's the one I've done the most essays with. But there was also all these little music magazines that don't even exist anymore, and these little there was this magazine called Joints Magazine, and it was like a little it was a just underground hip hop and underground
so
electronic.
It wasn't an internet dime bag of a site, no?
They had a website, but it was actually,
I was playing with the notion of Joints Magazine.
Oh, well, there was that too, but they definitely used to have like a little, they from time to time they would have an article or two how to roll something, or whatever. And one of the founders of it now owns a dispensary, but that's another story. And That's not so much a part of the life these days, but it was,
Right.
there
It
was
used
that,
to be part of my life or something. But anyway.
there was some of that, you know, but it was, in general, it was just a whole bunch of young people that were really invested in the culture. And, you know, and we really did believe that a good night of poetry or a good night of music was not only a way of self-expression, but it was a liberatory practice. It was a practice of liberation. And I always say this too, a lot of us came from dysfunctional families. A lot of us came from divorced families. So some of it was the poetry scene, was us creating the family that we wish we would have had.
Mm-hmm. That sense of community and brotherhood and sisterhood and just livinghood, you know?
That was a major part of it. I mean, a major part of it. And we used to do these poetry events. And then after the poetry event, we'd go to somebody's house, or after the poetry event, we went to a live music event, and it was a real, there was a lot of connection. It was
so how is that? Yeah. So, you know, you find that during, I gotta say, of course, the cliche thing of talk about, it's affecting everyone with the pandemic. You don't have as much of that. It's a lot harder to find that sort of connection, relationship, and how's that kind of affected. In fact, I know you teach as well, to kind of jumping around. How has that affected your, as a professor? How has that affected, your interaction with students, as well as, with your, I find for myself that meeting other people and the kind of the places you've been, the memories and that you make along the way, sometimes in real time, and investigating and observing, as well as using your memories that kind of influence you, kind of like almost like alive, right? You can kind of get these things together and paint this kind of tapestries as you're walking down the boulevard or whatnot, or going down Main Street, which is a bit away from me. So how does that affect, as well as, the ability of just conversing from this in-person way, that, there's almost like this distancing, or there's this removal that it's, okay, I can't, less likely to go up to some random person and all of a sudden just go on a journey, and then that affect your process. There's a lot less of that these days.
You bring up a good point, and actually, in March and April, when I was first forced to teach via Zoom, I was at that moment in time really giving students just space to vent. We would just talk about where everybody's head was, and how everybody was doing, and I had them doing one writing assignment a week. I changed the curriculum because
that's not that much.
To go on like nothing had happened to me wasn't right for the students. So I'm somebody who believes in adjusting accordingly, and so I gave them some writing assignments to let them vent. I gave them writing assignments. One of the writing assignments at the time I gave them was to do a self-portrait of where your head is right now. Write a self-portrait. What are you feeling at this moment in time? And then another thing, I had them do this mapping assignment where they kind of draw a map and they write about either a very significant place in their childhood, or maybe even a few spots in their neighborhood, whether it be a restaurant that they went to, their church, the favorite art gallery, or maybe some people go to this certain point on the beach. But I was trying to have them do assignments which were empowering and kind of value affirmation, affirming where they were from. And so a lot of what I do with my students is I really just give them space to explore their own selves and their lives.
Yeah, to dive in.
And I feel like from that awareness, then they can take on the world.
Exactly.
And so
and you can find the city in you, letters to yourself.
That's it, man. And so about 5 years ago, I stopped giving tests. I'm a project-based learning professor. I do a whole lot of projects, and I have them turn in a portfolio of writing at the end of the semester. And I've had several students publish chapbooks and publish poems and publish books out of stuff that they worked in my class.
And that's a great thing. You know, I had a professor for me that suggested, like, you know, I was working on thesis in the middle of in the library, you know, for philosophy and, you know, really consciousness studies, philosophy, neuroscience, and you know, read it something, and then, you know, finished thesis, and, you know, before graduation, he's like, you know, pulled me over and he's said, Josh, you know, you might really want to submit something, and to have people who kind of motivate and kind of can really just point very slightly, not say too much of exactly, but allow you to find the path, but just guide it slightly. That's really important to have individuals like that. And the more we can kind of pick that up and recognize that is important. Like, not just give all the answers, but just be able to just slight, here's a possibility.
Hey, Josh, that's about one of my 2 or 3 favorite things to do as a professor. And sometimes I'm like, oh, you know what? I could tell that I'm just going to be hypothetical here. And this is, let's say that I met you 5 years ago. I bet this guy Joshua would like Kerouac, or you know what I mean? Like, I've done that kind of thing where, you know what, she really needs.
I've been listening to On the Road at Night. It's been washing my psyche. I'd never read it, and it's amazing. And, you know, a good audio recording. I can't hear who it is, but anyways, to get back to what you're saying.
But just that, you know, pointing in the direction of A, submit your work, or B, you might like this author, or, hey, have you ever been to this gallery, or have you ever checked out that bookstore? And I feel like a lot of my job really is just to encourage and like you said, just that subtle pointing in the right direction, you know, and from those actions, because I had a few people do it for me, and it's a real symbiotic relationship. It really. And so that's why I really enjoy teaching. And at times it's really hard work, but on a good day, it's like you're not even working.
Yeah. And when then people go back and say, hey, you know, you did this, and I want to thank you. That's like $1 million right there.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. It reminds me of, you know, there's a story, I think it's in the Bible or in the Torah, when Joseph is, I believe it's Joseph, is kind of, he's lost and he has to go back home, and where he's going to be kind of captured and then, you know, sold into slavery by his brothers. And, you know, he's kind of lost. And he's like, you know, where's the way to go to whatever? I forget where it is. And, you know, all of a sudden there's some random dude, and you never know who it is. And there's no name or whatever, just appears out of nowhere and says, oh yeah, I saw this. I know where to go. You know, I saw where the people were going. Go this way. Just points them in that path. And if that didn't happen, then X, Y, Z, and all this stuff wouldn't happen. And you kind of have these angels of people in your life in human form, you know? Because in our humanity, I think really is our transcendence, to kind of grow, to create something, to create art, let our lives be art. You know, I wonder if you have, you know, a poem or something about that you could share about, you know, about teaching, or about professing potentially, or maybe about that kind of life guiding that we've been talking about.
You know what? I have a pretty new poem that kind of connects to that a bit.
Would you be willing to profess us, Mr. Mike Sonksen, aka Mike the Poet? Would you profess us with your poem?
Hey, this is a new piece that actually I've been working on for a little while, on and off, and it's not even entirely finished, but it's a draft. It combines some of my philosophy with teaching, but also it's called Visitors Are Welcome. The Silk Road runs through Los Angeles. Inner body awareness dwells in the present moment. Geographic literacy is wilderness listening. The bell is ringing, heed your calling. Visitors are welcome. Accept energetic consciousness, steeped in deep ecology, surrender to a higher purpose. When action, feeling, and spirituality unite, there's a deeper connection with life. Beyond the scientific method, ecology cannot be measured. Together we are the earth, a superorganism of living systems, linked by sacred underpinning. Connected by decisions that ripple across the planet, Gaia is the granite, a foundation far bigger than a microcosm. The tree of life, a fresh worldview. You are I am you, we are one despite those who attempt to build barricades. Their lemonade is toxic, Deep ecology is the process of facing Earth's problems with holistic platform. Breathing in, we all walk on. The crows, the lizards, the dogs, the frogs, the rocks, the pepper trees, the sycamores, the eucalyptus, the dirt mounds, branches on the ground, the cactus, the ferns, the berries, the spiders, the manzanita, the sage, the ants, the rabbits, the roots, the burnt brush. The foothills are all us. Citizens of the land know their watersheds and ecosystems. Biological exploitation and imperialism propagated through flawed traditions promote tone-deaf demons. Extracting life force from the source, we are all composite beings with shared ways of seeing.
Snap, snap, clap, clap. Yeah, it's interesting if we can kind of maybe dive in there a bit. And the line also, what was it? It really got me. Something is, their lemonade is toxic. And I don't know why that just got me for a second, and it's kind of like, you have this cool, whatnot, and yet, I don't know. And what was the very last line at the end, the very last 2-3 lines?
We are all composite beings with shared ways of seeing.
Exactly. And so we kind of like, we're all put together. We're pieces of, our memories and everything that we kind of, that is given to us, that we get, opportunities where we go, our memories, these whole things. And they're kind of these shared ways of kind of dealing with this whole reality tunnel that we're in, so to speak.
Yeah.
To use someone's, I forget what his name of his coined term of reality tunnel. Anyway, and we all have that, and and certain people, get to shape and kind of see that and get to be part of us. So when they kind of pass on or different things, or they're far away, part of them is part of us, and it's reciprocal.
Yes, sir. You're speaking of, this is something, I've really only become really aware of in the last 5-10 years. And like you sort of have hints in it when you're younger, but Western culture has always been about this sort of the subject and the object. And sort of
right. This kind of, relationship rather than this dynamic and more, noun-based almost, or not noun-based. That's,
no, what I mean? The subject, the object, this sort of binary, these oppositions, and really
linear kind of causality, so to speak, and delineations.
Yeah, and really, I went to Japan a few years ago, but I've also been reading a combination of a lot of things. Some of it was deep ecology and certain eco thinkers. Some of it was Buddhism, but some of it also is just I've been reading. I kind of keep coming across certain ideas, and as I was teaching a class called Natures, and that we are the earth. The earth is an organism. The earth is a living being, and we are all living beings. And we are all really a part of each other, but some people want to either build walls, or some people want to say we're separate, or this or that. And I mean, it's
tear down walls that never were.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different people trying to separate themselves, but really, whether we like it or not, we are all together. And from that understanding, also, they always say that one of the other issues of Western culture is sort of this separation of the heart and the mind, and really,
then you have in cultures, you have this more of a heart-mind connection.
And if you can connect the heart and mind, you're going to make decisions that are more grounded and
authentic.
I myself have been guilty of being too cerebral at times, or the other way around.
Hey, me too.
I've been too in my heart too, and so you want to kind of find an equal ground between the two, and nature is perhaps the quickest gateway to that. Something like looking at a sunset, or taking a hike, or going to the beach. And I regret I haven't really had a chance to get out in nature a whole lot lately. Some of it is that we're partially caretaking for my mother-in-law who has dementia, and some of it is
my grandmother has Alzheimer's, pretty into it. Yeah.
And when you're taking care of the family, and my kids are small, and so I don't get out as much as I did before. but also, having a daily practice. You and I have talked about a writing practice, and and I like to read a lot, and you have to have a few activities that really ground you. And so for me at this point in time, it's really reading and writing, and and conversing with people when I can. And I'll say one thing: if the quarantine and COVID-19 had hit when I was in my 20s and 30s, I wouldn't have been able to handle it as well as I've been handling it now. Because back in the day, I had cabin fever, and I used to just be around that. I was never home. But the last 6 months, man, I've just been reading. I probably read between 40 and 50 books in the last 6 months, and it's been a lot of fun. It's been actually nice to just be home and taking bike rides with my kids and staying home. But I think there is a time for me, like when I was your age, like I said, we were all over the city. We might be in Griffith Park, we might be in Topanga Canyon, we might be down in Palos Verdes, we might be in the Inland Empire, we might be in Long Beach. And at the time, traveling all over the city was a real inspirational point for me. Now I sit with myself a little bit more, and I sit with my family. But you need to have a few practices that you do that not only ground you, but remind you of who you are.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. I find for me also it's important. What I'll do is I found this for the last few years, or 2-3 years or so, meditating for about 45 minutes. Also take some time, shaving, showering, or whatnot. Maybe a bit here. Anyway. Listeners, you might not be able to see this. Just picture a very sexy man. There's two sexy men together, and pile of books and movie posters. In the beautiful California sunshine. Yeah, and I find that for me, I will listen to some Hasidic literature and put on this video, and it's less kind of about I'll trust and have faith that I hear the words and understand them, and it'll kind of get inspire wash over me as I'm kind of showering or as I'm shaving or making breakfast. And that is another thing I'll do in the midday. And I found that can affect kind of my poetry, that can inspire, and as well as with writing. And I think it's important. Music is also a big point. I've discovered, got more into jazz, like Miles Davis, but also like kind of looking at different stuff. I guess not really as much jazz, like Herbie Hancock and kind of certain things. And your poetry is very, and that brings to another point, is very musical. Or not musical, it's lyrical. It has a beat. I know that hip hop and different, around that time that we talked about has really been quite influential. And I just wondered, are there particular things that you find like, okay, if I'm editing a piece, or if I'm like listening to music where like I haven't, man, I just gotta get out my iPhone and just or whatever phone you use, just hit the record while you're driving and just dropping some words, dropping some knowledge on there and just record, and kind of how that, and what's your process like? Because I'm sure there are other people who might do some certain things or have some certain processes, but they don't know it's okay to do that. It's okay to stop and take time to address your creativity. And I just wonder kind of how you've gone to that, how that's played, and kind of maybe, early on in the beginning when you started to do something, and then kind of what it's like now.
That's hilarious. I mean, because I've talked about this before, where we used to, in some of the years when I lived in different apartments with different friends, we would, my buddy, I always talk about, because my friend Philip Martin, aka Phil Harmonic, he lives in Brooklyn now. He's a poet, painter, and a soccer coach.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Real great artist, just versatile Renaissance dude. We lived together at 3 different points. We lived together at UCLA. We lived together in our early 20s, and then we even lived together in our later 20s, and we lived in different apartments together. But we used to, Garth Trinidad, the radio DJ from KCRW, had a show in the late 90s called Chocolate City. And it was a really great show. And he was always debuting the latest, more avant-garde music that was sometimes underground hip hop, Sometimes it was downbeat electronica. Sometimes he was playing 70s funk, soul, and jazz. Sometimes he was playing
Very groovy.
He was playing the records that Tribe Called Quest sampled, or he was playing Herbie Hancock, like you said, or he was playing just different. But so we used to listen to a lot of Garth Trinidad, and there was a time, I would say late 90s, early 2000s, that man was really kind of the soundtrack for a lot of creative LA. And I mean, there were other people as well, but we used to listen to his music a lot, and there was plenty of times where, as I was writing, music was on. And so music was it's funny because I used to write at night, and I used to write from 10 p.m. till 2, 3, 4 in the mornings, several nights a week. Or, we were out a lot. We were out a lot too.
The midnight hour, the waking hour, the twilight.
Yeah, and now there's plenty of days where I'm getting up at 5:30 or 6 in the morning. I in the last 5, 6 years.
Well, yeah, as a professor,
Yeah, in the last 5, 6 years, there's probably only been 3, 4, 5 nights where I stayed out after midnight. We used to, nowadays I'm coming right home to my wife and my kids or whatever, or, in quarantine, obviously we're not even going out. But some of it was we were night owls, and some of it was listening. I used to love to write at night. Now, I write every half hour I can get. Sometimes it's for an hour.
And cherish it.
Teach. Yeah, and just it's a lot more. And also back in the day, you'd have to have Nag Champa burning, or you'd be burning some sage, or it had to be like the perfect condition. Now, man, it's just whenever and however, and it's funny, but in your 20s, for me, we were real romantic, and we were purist, and it was always about having. We would go to Elysian Park, and we would bring our notebooks, and we would sit up, just on the other side of Dodger Stadium, or we would go to Echo Park, or we would go to Griffith Park, or we would go to Topanga Canyon, or we'd go to Venice, and we'd have our notebooks. Now, nowadays, like I might be sitting next to my daughter while she's doing her work, and I'm doing mine, or so yeah. I mean, I still try to find the romance in it, though. I mean, it has become more.
Important.
I've become maybe more blue collar as the years have gone on, just because it is work. And have you ever read Natalie Goldberg?
I have not.
She is one of the best writing coaches ever. She had a book called Writing Down the Bones. She's actually written about 8 or 10
Great
books.
title.